Tonight we will be exploring the art and science of mastering table dynamics when facing loose aggressive poker players. These players are known for their unpredictable and relentless betting styles, creating a unique sense of volatility and challenge at the table. Understanding how they operate is a crucial skill for any serious poker player, as their presence can transform the flow of the game and influence the decisions of everyone around them. By learning to recognize the subtle cues and patterns that distinguish loose aggressive players, you gain the ability to anticipate their moves and craft responses that are both measured and effective. We will focus on how to maintain your composure, adjust your strategies, and leverage the natural strengths of your own play against those who thrive on aggression and chaos. Throughout this listening experience, you will become attuned to the psychological elements at play, from managing tilt and emotional decision-making to harnessing the power of patience and timing. The goal is to equip you with the confidence and clarity needed to navigate even the most turbulent tables, turning challenging encounters into opportunities for growth and profit. As you listen, you can expect a gentle, steady pace designed to encourage calm reflection, with no sudden changes in audio or visuals. Let your mind settle into the rhythm, knowing that each concept is presented with care and precision, supporting your learning and your rest. By the end, you will feel grounded in your ability to not only withstand the pressure created by loose aggressive players, but to thrive in their presence, ready to apply these insights whenever you next take your seat at the table. Chapter 1. Understanding loose aggressive players. There's a certain type of player who doesn't need a strong hand to get involved. They raise early, they raise often, and they're rarely waiting for the action to find them. These are the players you'll hear described as loose aggressive. They look for opportunities to play a wide range of hands, and they do it with energy and confidence. You'll notice them putting chips in the pot more often than most, especially before the flop. They're not shy about taking control of the action. What really sets these players apart is how often they choose to raise or re-raise, rather than just call. When you see someone consistently making the first move, putting in 3 bets, and ramping up the pressure from late positions like the button or the cutoff, you're likely watching a loose aggressive approach in action. Their range of starting hands is much wider than what you'll see from tight aggressive players, who tend to stick to the top 15 to 20% of hands. A loose aggressive player might get involved with roughly 25 to 35% of hands or more, particularly when they're in a favorable position. It's important to see the difference between loose aggressive and loose passive players. Both might play a lot of hands, but only the aggressive types are constantly betting and raising. The passive ones are more likely to call or check, hoping to see a cheap flop or sneak into a pot without much confrontation. Loose aggressive players, on the other hand, thrive on confrontation. They'll use all kinds of bet sizes, sometimes even making overbets to keep opponents guessing and uncomfortable. You'll also find that loose aggressive players adapt their aggression based on position. When they're in late position, they're much more likely to open raise with hands that most players would fold. This gives them an edge by putting pressure on the blinds and anyone who's already checked. Their style is dynamic, and it's built around keeping the initiative. If you see someone varying their bet sizes and rarely just checking or calling, you've probably found your loose aggressive player. Spotting these traits early gives you more time to adjust. The sooner you recognize what you're dealing with, the better positioned you are to respond with intention. The way loose aggressive players bet is just as telling as the range of hands they choose. Pre-flop, you'll often see them coming in for raises from late positions. They don't wait for premium starting hands. Instead, they pressure players in the blinds, and anyone left to act by forcing tough decisions with wider ranges. If you notice frequent open raises from the button, cutoff, or even the small blind, you're probably watching a loose aggressive approach. Once the flop comes down, these players keep up the pressure with continuation bets. Whether they connected with the board or not often makes little difference to how they play the hand. The goal is to take down the pot before showdown, especially when they sense opponents are folding more than they should. Their aggression tends to carry forward. On the turn and river, they'll often increase their bet sizes. Sometimes they'll push well beyond the pot, and for opponents holding marginal hands, that can make folding feel like the more comfortable path. This constant aggression changes the mood at the table. Pots tend to grow, and the pace of the game shifts noticeably. Players who aren't comfortable with pressure across multiple streets may start folding hands they'd typically feel fine playing. Tight players in early positions can feel especially uncomfortable, knowing that if they enter a pot, there's a good chance the loose aggressive player will make things expensive. Players who prefer a quieter pace may find the tempo unsettling. Their betting patterns aren't random. They're built around the idea that making opponents fold is often just as valuable as holding the best hand at showdown. This creates volatility. If you're sitting at a table with one or more loose aggressive players, you'll notice that the average pot size goes up, and the swings can be more dramatic. The impact on table dynamics is significant. Opponents who prefer a slower pace can sometimes begin making mistakes, folding more than they should, or calling down with hands that aren't strong enough. Many loose aggressive players notice this discomfort and actively look for ways to use it. Recognizing these patterns early gives you a better chance of staying ahead of the pressure rather than reacting to it. If you want to understand why loose aggressive players act the way they do, you need to look beneath the surface. For some, the excitement of being at the center of the action is a strong motivator. The constant betting and raising can be thrilling, especially when it leads to big pots and dramatic moments. That draw toward excitement is one of the things that shapes how they approach the game. There's also a desire for dominance at play. Some loose aggressive players want to be the table captain. They tend to enjoy setting the pace, putting others to difficult decisions, and keeping a firm hand on the flow of the game. Frequent betting and raising let them assert themselves, demonstrating control over the pace and direction of the hand. For these players, winning a hand is not just about the cards. It's about proving their skill and keeping others off balance. Confidence plays a role as well. Loose aggressive players often believe they can outplay opponents after the flop, even with weaker starting hands. Their willingness to take risks comes from a combination of self-assurance and a high tolerance for swings. They're comfortable with volatility, knowing that their aggression will pay off over many hands, especially against players who react passively. Psychological pressure is another dimension of their approach. By putting opponents to the test again and again, loose aggressive players hope to force mistakes. Some do this intentionally, looking for signs of weakness they can exploit. Others may not even realize they're applying pressure in this way, but the effect is the same. Opponents who aren't prepared for this kind of sustained pressure may find themselves frustrated or off balance, which can lead to decisions they wouldn't otherwise make. Some loose aggressive players tend to expand their hand ranges when they sense weaker opponents at the table. They see opportunities to push around less experienced players, using their aggression to exploit mistakes. This isn't just about enjoying the action or proving a point. It's also about maximizing profit by taking advantage of perceived edges. Understanding the mindset behind loose aggressive play gives you a foundation for responding effectively. When you know what motivates these players, you're better equipped to anticipate their moves and adjust your own strategy. This insight is essential before you start thinking about specific tactics or countermeasures. Take your time to observe these patterns at the table. Watch how they choose their spots. Watch how they size their bets. Watch how they respond when someone finally pushes back. Each detail you pick up adds to your ability to read the table and make strong decisions. With practice, you'll find that recognizing these players becomes second nature, and you'll be ready to respond with a plan of your own. Let the pace settle, and let these observations become your guide as you move forward. Chapter 2: Evaluating Table Dynamics. One player raising constantly changes how everyone else thinks. The whole environment reshapes itself around that pressure. Pots grow larger than usual, and the rhythm of the whole game starts to change. Other players start reacting to all that aggression. Some tighten up and wait for strong hands. Others try to fight back, though they usually do so with caution. That pressure ripples outward and pulls people toward decisions they wouldn't normally make. The game flow shifts, and you will notice that people's decisions become more defensive. Players start thinking carefully about where they're seated. Some will ask for a seat change, hoping to position themselves directly after that player, so they can act with more information. You'll also notice betting patterns shift. With a frequent raiser in the mix, limping becomes less appealing for most players. Fewer small pots develop, and more big ones take their place. That kind of environment changes nearly every decision you make. Playing well in this environment means staying willing to adjust. Sticking to a fixed plan can leave you vulnerable to falling behind. It can also pull you toward passive play that gives up too much ground. The players who do well are the ones who keep adapting. One of the first things you can do is pay close attention to your position. When you are acting after the loose aggressive player, you have more information about what they want to do. This extra knowledge makes your decisions easier and usually more profitable. Being out of position against them tends to be more difficult. You're committing to a decision before you know what they want to do. You might also find it helpful to expand your calling range a little, especially against frequent raises. Since their range is wide, not all of their bets represent real strength. Getting comfortable, calling a bit lighter in the right spots, can sometimes help you pick off their weaker bets. That said, trying to match their aggression hand for hand usually isn't the right approach. Instead, look for good spots to apply pressure with strong hands, and do not be afraid to let go of marginal holdings when things get heated. Patience matters here. Strong-made hands don't come around often. For example, if you hold a pocket pair, you'll flop a set roughly 1 in every 8 times on average. Flopping 2 pair with an unpaired starting hand is fairly rare. It happens roughly 2% of the time. That means you should not expect to make a big hand very often. When you do connect with a strong hand, loose aggressive players are often more willing to put chips in with weaker holdings than a tighter opponent might be. If the table starts to tighten up in response to all the action, you might even find spots to steal pots with well-timed bets or raises. Just be careful not to get drawn into unnecessary battles with weak hands. Another thing to watch out for is your own tendency to become too passive or reactive. It's easy to settle into a rhythm of calling or folding without ever taking initiative. That can be a reasonable approach with weaker hands, but you don't want to let one player dictate every pot. Mixing in occasional raises with strong hands can discourage them from pushing you around. You don't need to match every raise, but you do want to avoid becoming an easy target. As the game progresses, you will start to pick up on cues that the table dynamics are shifting. One sign is when players start asking for seat changes, either to act after that player or to get farther away from the pressure. You might notice betting frequency going up, with more 3-bets and larger preflop raises than before. Sometimes, players who were active earlier now fold more often, or only get involved with premium hands. These are all signals that the presence of the loose aggressive player is influencing the whole table. When most players are pulling back, that's a chance to open up your own range and pick up pots that nobody else wants. When the table is getting wilder, stronger hands and more patience tend to serve you better. Tracking how often people are folding or calling compared to earlier in the session helps you notice these shifts before they've fully settled in. It helps to check in with yourself periodically. Is the atmosphere tense or relaxed? Are people playing loosely, or have they pulled back? Has the overall aggression level shifted over the last few hands? Those observations can guide your next move. Staying flexible means you're not just reacting to one player. You're watching how the whole table is responding to them. Sometimes waiting while others clash with the aggressor is the right call. Other times, the caution that follows a burst of aggression opens up spots worth taking. When you start recognizing these patterns and responding in the moment, your decisions tend to improve over time. The table might feel chaotic, but even the wildest games have their rhythms. That awareness makes it easier to find profitable spots, even when things feel out of control. You don't have to force anything. Keeping your focus on how the game is evolving and adjusting along the way is usually enough. Patience and awareness can reveal opportunities that aggressive play tends to overlook. Chapter 3: Identifying lag patterns. Reading a player takes time, but the clock starts the moment they sit down. Every hand they play, every bet they make, and every reaction they show is data you can collect and use. In live cash games, one of the earliest things you'll notice is how often a player reaches for chips. These players tend to move chips around more than others. They make decisions quickly, sometimes tossing in bets without much hesitation. Over time, these behaviors start to stand out. Consistency matters here. If a player acts swiftly and boldly in one hand, that might not mean much. But if you see the same person making aggressive moves hand after hand, that's a reasonable signal you're looking at a loose aggressive style. Physical cues like frequent chip movements or repeated rapid bets can be useful signals, but they are only part of the story. Sometimes a player's posture or the way they engage with the table can also give you clues. Someone who stays alert, leans forward, and seems eager to get involved in pots is often showing you early signs of that style. Still, you'll want to make sure you are seeing these behaviors over several hands before you draw any firm conclusions. A single instance could be a fluke, but a pattern tells you much more. Behavioral cues often reveal things that betting patterns alone do not. For example, a player might look relaxed and confident when making a large bet. They might also hold conversations while playing, showing they're comfortable with the pace. These are subtle indicators, but when you see them consistently, they help you build a reliable picture of who's likely to play loose and aggressive. It is not just about watching what people do with their chips. Sometimes you can notice a player's approach by how they interact with others at the table. Beyond chips and cards, you can also pick up on how these players interact with the table around them. They often influence the tempo of the game. Some will try to set the pace, encourage action, or needle other players to get a reaction. These are subtle cues that, when added up with physical habits, can help you label a player's style more accurately. Observation like this takes time. You collect these details across many hands and update your read as new information comes in. Once you start to recognize these players by their physical habits and table demeanor, The next step is to watch for patterns in how they bet and raise. One of the clearest early signals is frequent preflop raising. When you see someone consistently entering pots with a raise rather than a call, that's a signal worth noting. They tend not to wait for strong starting hands. Taking control early is part of how they operate. The aggression usually does not stop after the flop. You'll often spot loose aggressive players following up with strong bets on the flop, turn, and sometimes the river. They tend to apply pressure across multiple streets, making it harder for opponents to know where they stand. This kind of consistent pressure can create mistakes and push opponents to give up holdings they might otherwise defend. Watching for that pattern over several hands helps you separate the players who are genuinely driving the action from those who are simply reacting to it. There are more technical ways to spot these patterns, especially if you are tracking statistics. In No Limit Texas Hold'em, you might hear about VPIP and PFR. VPIP stands for voluntarily put money in pot, and PFR means pre-flop raise. Loose aggressive players tend to have a relatively narrow gap between these two stats. As a rough benchmark, the gap between the two tends to fall somewhere between 7 and 15 percentage points, though this varies depending on the player and the game. That means they are not just calling, they are raising a lot of the hands they play. If you see a pre-flop raise percentage above 30% in a cash game, that can be a reasonable signal that someone is playing a wider and more aggressive range than most. Still, you should consider things like table size, position, and how they play after the flop before making a final judgment. These players also tend to be more active from late positions. The cutoff and button give them better information and stronger opportunities to steal blinds or apply pressure. If you notice someone consistently opening pots from those spots, that positional pattern is another piece of the profile you're building. Spotting these betting and raising patterns helps you anticipate what's coming. When you know a player likes to raise pre-flop and fire on multiple streets, you can start thinking ahead. You might tighten up and let them overextend, or you might look for spots to call down lighter than usual. Either way, the better you recognize these patterns, the more prepared you'll be to counter them. Bluffing is another key piece of the loose aggressive puzzle. These players often rely on frequent bluffing to keep up their aggressive image and put pressure on the table. If you want to get a sense of how often a loose aggressive player is bluffing, start by tracking the ratio of their aggressive actions to how often you see their hands at showdown. If someone bets and raises frequently, but shows up with weak or marginal hands at showdown on more than one occasion, that can be a reasonable early sign they're bluffing more often than a typical player might. It is important to remember that you need a large sample size to get a reliable read. 1 or 2 hands at showdown might not tell you much. But if, over the course of a session, you see the same player betting hard and showing down bluffs more than usual, you can start to trust your read. As a general tendency, players with this style often bluff more frequently after the flop than tighter opponents, though individual habits vary quite a bit. Some players might slow down when called, while others double down on their bluffs. Context shapes how you read bluffing frequency. Consider the overall pace of the table, whether the player has been winning pots recently, and how their opponents have been responding. If a player is getting away with lots of bluffs, they may continue applying that pressure. If they get caught, some will tighten up, while others will keep pushing regardless. By paying attention to these shifts, you can anticipate when they are likely to bluff again and adjust your strategy to exploit those tendencies. The details you collect hand by hand start to form a picture you can actually use. You'll begin to anticipate moves before they happen. The game moves at the same pace it always has. What changes is how clearly you're able to read it. Chapter 4: Exploiting Loose Aggressive Weaknesses. The raises come early, and the bets keep coming. Before the flop, on the flop, on the turn. It rarely lets up. But that constant motion carries a pattern, and within that pattern sits a weakness that patient opponents can find. One pattern you will notice is that these players often bet with hands that do not connect with the board. Their wide range means they miss more often, so they rely on aggression and semi-bluffs to win pots. They will keep betting even when the board does not help them, hoping their opponents fold. Over time, this approach leads them to overcommit chips in pots, where they have little real chance of winning. These mistakes create opportunities for patient opponents who recognize the pattern. It's common to see these players continue betting into resistance. They may fire another bet when you call on the flop, or keep raising when you push back. This tendency to push through even when facing resistance can become a source of value when you're holding the stronger hand, particularly when you stay disciplined enough not to give the hand away. If you stay disciplined and avoid showing weakness, they'll often continue putting chips in with marginal holdings. When you hold a strong hand, their continued aggression works in your favor. There is a temptation to fight fire with fire. When someone raises every hand, you might feel the urge to push back just as hard. This approach often creates more problems than it solves. Trying to outbluff them with weak or marginal hands often costs more than it returns over time, especially when their ranges are wide enough to call with hands that beat yours. Instead, let them drive the action. Allow their frequent bets to build the pot, then capitalize when you hold a strong hand. Patience is usually the stronger approach here. You do not need to win every hand. You only need to win the big ones, and let them make the costly mistakes that come with unchecked aggression. Hand selection shapes how well positioned you are before any of this can work. Tightening your range before the flop gives you a stronger foundation for the hands that follow. That does not mean you are only playing the very strongest hands available. It means you are staying away from marginal spots where a tough decision might force a difficult fold. Playing fewer but stronger hands against these opponents can produce better outcomes, particularly when they continue applying pressure into your made hands. Position is another critical factor. Acting after a loose aggressive player gives you more information and control over the size of the pot. You can let them bet first, then decide whether to call, raise, or fold, based on their actions and the strength of your hand. In position, you can also keep pots smaller, with medium-strength hands, and build bigger pots with your best holdings. This flexibility lets you turn their aggression into an advantage for yourself. Patience is not just about waiting for strong cards. It is also about choosing the right moments to engage. Loose aggressive players will give you many opportunities to catch them bluffing, but you do not have to take every one. Selective calling with medium-strength hands is a valuable tool. When you suspect they are betting with nothing, a well-timed call can turn their aggression into value for you. This approach tends to catch more bluffs and helps protect you from overextending in marginal spots. It is important to avoid getting drawn into emotional battles. The constant pressure from loose aggressive players can be frustrating, but reacting impulsively will only put you at risk. Stay focused on your own strategy. Let them dictate the pace until you see a clear spot to act. When you do engage, do so with confidence and a strong hand. That discipline helps you avoid unnecessary confrontations and keeps you in control of your results. Timing shapes how much value you extract from these situations. You do not need to respond to every bet. Look for spots where their range is wide and your hand is likely ahead. A well-timed call can return more profit than a raise when you sense weakness. With a strong hand, letting them continue their aggression often builds a bigger pot than raising immediately. Trapping and inducing bluffs are where patience becomes active. Rather than absorbing their pressure, you use it. One way to set a trap is to call their preflop raise with a premium hand rather than re-raising. This keeps their range wide and their confidence high. If you show too much strength early, they may slow down or fold. By simply calling, you leave room for them to keep betting on later streets. Many players in this style read passive resistance as weakness rather than strength, which can work in your favor when your hand is strong. Pot size also matters here. When you check a strong hand on the flop or the turn, they'll often read it as weakness and fire again. If you're in position, you can check behind and let the pot develop. When they continue betting on later streets, you're in a strong position to call or raise. The goal is to give them room to bluff or overextend, maximizing your value when the time is right. Psychology plays a big role here. Loose, aggressive players thrive on momentum and the feeling that they are in control. Passive resistance can be disorienting for some players in this style. When you don't fight back immediately, there's a reasonable chance they read it as weakness and keep pushing. This creates opportunities for you to spring your trap and catch them when they are most vulnerable. Timing your trap is critical. Wait for those moments when you have a strong hand and the loose, aggressive player is showing no signs of slowing down. Spring the trap too early, and you may leave value on the table. Wait too long, and you risk letting them catch a card or escape before the pot is fully built. The best traps are set when your opponent is confident, the pot is building, and your hand is well disguised. It's worth keeping in mind that any specific pocket pair has only 6 possible card combinations, compared to 16 for any specific unpaired hand, where both cards are different suits and ranks. Strong starting hands are rare, and loose, aggressive players are not waiting for them. Much of their range consists of weaker holdings, which increases the chance they'll overplay a marginal hand against your strength. When a trap works, you're not just collecting a single pot. You're beginning to take advantage of the tendencies that can make these players vulnerable across many hands. That dynamic compounds over time. Each hand where they lead and you follow with the stronger holding adds to a pattern they won't easily recognize. Disguising your hand strength connects both of these approaches. If your actions consistently reflect what you're holding, attentive opponents will start to read you accurately. Mixing in some slow plays and passive lines keeps your range balanced and unpredictable. This encourages loose, aggressive players to keep betting into you, never quite sure where they stand. Developing these counter strategies goes beyond any single pot. Each time you respond with patience and a well-timed trap, you're reinforcing a style that holds up across many different tables and many different opponents. As you settle back and watch the action, let the loose, aggressive players do the heavy lifting. Let them build pots and create pressure, knowing that your patience and timing will put you in the right spot when it matters. The game slows down, the rhythm becomes familiar, and you find those moments where everything lines up in your favor. There is a quiet satisfaction in letting the action come to you and knowing you are ready to act when the time is right. Chapter 5. Adjusting your preflop strategy. When you sit down at a table with these opponents, you'll notice the pace of the game changes. Standard approaches that work against passive opponents tend to hold up less well here. Instead, you'll face frequent raises and re-raises before the flop. Your usual hand selection starts to feel the pressure quickly. It becomes more important to focus on hands that can hold real equity when pots grow large and the action stays aggressive. Most new players start out by opening with a fairly wide range, especially in later positions. This can work well in games where opponents do not fight back often. But once you face someone who is raising and re-raising liberally, those marginal hands tend to lose a lot of their value in a hurry. If you keep entering pots with weak aces or suited connectors that fold to the first 3-bet, you'll find yourself leaking chips eventually. That is why you need to tighten up your starting hand selection when a loose aggressive player is in the pot. Here's a way to think about the numbers. There are 1,326 different starting hand combinations in Texas Hold'em. You're dealt any pocket pair roughly 6% of the time, meaning about 1 in 17 hands. If you simply play your usual range, you'll end up with a lot of hands that do not stand up well against frequent aggression. Instead, you want to focus on hands that can continue profitably after facing a raise or even a re-raise. Pocket pairs, strong Broadway combinations, and suited high cards generally perform better in bigger, more contested pots. Tightening your range isn't a sign of playing scared. It's a recognition that some hands aren't built for the kind of pressure you're likely to face. The hands you choose should be able to hold up across multiple bets, both before and after the flop. If you keep entering pots with hands that lose their value the moment the action heats up, you'll fold too often and leave chips on the table in spots where you actually had the best hand. It's also worth recognizing that this adjustment isn't just about avoiding trouble. By narrowing your pre-flop range, you put yourself in a better position to fight back when the loose aggressive player tries to run you over. You're less likely to be dominated, and more likely to have real equity when the pot gets big. Over time, this kind of adjustment can make you more resilient in games where that pressure is constant. Now let's talk about how you actually respond to all that aggression before the flop. One of the most effective ways to punish loose aggressive players is by re-raising them with strong hands. Since they are opening with so many combinations, their range is much wider than it should be. When you 3-bet or 4-bet with premium hands, you tend to put them in a difficult spot. Their weaker holdings often struggle to continue profitably. Calling out of position with a wide range tends to leave them at a disadvantage. Premium pocket pairs don't come around very often. When you do pick up a strong hand, you want to maximize its value. Selective re-raising is how you do that. If you re-raise every time, you become more predictable and easier to adjust against. But if you pick your spots, focusing on hands that play well in big pots, you force the loose aggressive player to either give up or put in more chips with a weak holding. Sizing matters as well. A re-raise that's too small tends to give them a good price to call with speculative hands. One that's too large can end up isolating you against only their strongest holdings. The goal is to find a size that pressures their marginal holdings while still getting value from the hands you want to play. Usually this means making your 3-bets and 4-bets large enough to discourage loose calls, but not so big that you force only the strongest hands to continue. That balance is what keeps you from being reactive. When you pick your spots carefully, you stop chasing the pace they've set. The pots you do play tend to be ones where you hold a real edge. Timing shapes how effective your re-raising becomes. You don't have to 3-bet every time they open. Calling with a strong hand can make sense when you'd prefer a smaller pot or when other players are still to act. Knowing when to apply pressure and when to step back is part of what makes this adjustment work. Position is another piece of the puzzle. When you act after the loose aggressive player, you get to see how they behave before you make your decision. This extra information is valuable. If you are in the cutoff or on the button, you can watch the action unfold and adjust your strategy accordingly. This tends to matter more because loose aggressive players often increase their aggression from late positions, looking to steal blinds and pick up easy pots. When you have position, you can control the size of the pot and put pressure on the loose aggressive player when it makes sense. You also have the option to let them continue betting into you when you have a strong hand. Leveraging your position allows you to make more informed decisions and reduces the risk of running into traps. Table image comes into play as well. If you have been playing tight, loose aggressive players may start to give you more credit for strength when you do enter a pot. This can make your re-raises more effective, as they are less likely to fight back without a strong hand. On the other hand, if you have been active and seen as loose, they may be more willing to test you with marginal holdings. Being aware of how you are perceived lets you adjust your pre-flop strategy to exploit their tendencies. A tight image makes your late position raises carry more weight. Opponents who'd normally push back tend to give you more room, and that plays out in two ways. Sometimes you pick up the pot quietly. Other times you get more chips in when you're holding something real. Tables with loose aggressive players can shift quickly. Some opponents will adjust once they notice you fighting back. Others will keep pressing, regardless of what you do. The best approach is to stay alert and be willing to update your reads as the game evolves. Tighten up when the pressure builds, and give yourself more room when the table calms down. Your position and image should always factor into that decision. When you learn to adjust your pre-flop strategy this way, you are no longer at the mercy of loose aggressive players. You become the one setting the terms, choosing when to engage and when to step back. The game slows down, and you start to see patterns unfold. Each decision becomes more deliberate, and over time you'll find yourself winning more than your share of contested pots. Let the table breathe for a moment, and notice how your choices shape the flow of the game. Chapter 6: Adapting Post-Flop Tactics. When you sit across from loose aggressive players, you'll start to see how pre-flop choices only set the stage. The real test comes after the flop. These opponents like to keep the action going, so you'll need to adjust your tactics to meet them directly. The first place to focus is your continuation betting strategy. Against loose aggressive players who call and raise with all sorts of hands, you'll want to be deliberate about when and how you fire that bet. The goal is to exploit their willingness to play too many hands and chase too many draws. When you bet the flop, think about whether the board favors your tighter starting range or their wider one. Dry boards tend to favor your tighter range. They're less likely to connect with the wide, draw-heavy hands these opponents prefer, which gives your bet a better chance of taking the pot uncontested. Wet boards can get tricky. Loose aggressive players love to continue on these boards with draws, marginal pairs, or even total bluffs. If you miss the flop or hold a marginal hand, think carefully before betting. Sometimes it's better to check and see what they do, especially if you're out of position. You'll also want to watch your bet sizing. Against loose aggressive players, using smaller continuation bets on dry boards can keep the pot manageable while still putting pressure on their weaker holdings. On wet boards, if you have a real hand, a larger bet can charge their draws and protect your equity. Picking your spots matters. When you have a hand that connects well with the board, a continuation bet is more likely to get value from their calls with worse hands. If you hold nothing, and the board hits their range more than yours, it's fine to check and conserve chips. You're not obligated to bet every time you raised pre-flop. Over time, you'll see that selective continuation betting helps you gain value while avoiding unnecessary risk. Now let's talk about what you see after you bet or check. Reading loose aggressive players on the flop is a skill that comes with practice and observation. These opponents often bet and raise more than others, so you'll want to pay close attention to their patterns. If you notice they bet nearly every flop, regardless of the board, you can start to infer that their range is wide and contains plenty of weak hands and bluffs. Keep track of how often they fire a second bet on the turn after betting the flop. Some of them will slow down on the turn when they have nothing or only a weak draw. When you notice their aggression drops from flop to turn, that shift can be a signal worth noting. It doesn't confirm anything on its own, but it's consistent with a flop bet that had little behind it. This can give you the chance to call flop bets with medium strength hands, planning to continue if they check the turn. If they keep betting strongly on both streets, you can tighten your calling range, since their hand is more likely to have real strength. The texture of the flop also tells you something about their likely holdings. On coordinated boards with lots of draws possible, loose aggressive players will often keep betting with all sorts of draws and marginal hands. This makes their strong hand range narrower, since most of the time they're continuing with speculative holdings. On dry boards, their bets can be even wider, since there's less for them to connect with, but also less for you to worry about. As you keep observing, try to notice any shifts in their behavior. Some loose aggressive players start out wild, then tighten up if they lose a few pots. Others get even looser after a big win. When you spot these shifts, adjust your strategy. If they're becoming more conservative, you may want to value bet more often. If they're getting even more aggressive, you might tighten up and let them bluff into your stronger hands. Pot control becomes more important as the hand progresses. Loose aggressive players like to build big pots with marginal hands and bluffs, which can put your stack at risk if you're not careful. Keeping the pot manageable lets you see more cards and make better decisions without risking too much. One way to control pot size is by checking back some flops or turns with medium strength hands, instead of always betting. This invites loose aggressive players to keep betting into you, but with the pot still at a size where you can call comfortably. When you do have a strong hand, letting them lead the betting can work in your favor. There's a trade-off here. If the board is very coordinated or you're deep stacked, slow playing can backfire by letting them catch up or build a pot that gets too big for your hand. It's worth considering the board texture and stack sizes before deciding how to proceed. Adjusting your aggression is about matching your bet sizes and frequency to the situation. When the pot is small, you can afford to be a bit looser with your bets and calls. As the pot grows, especially against a loose aggressive player, tighten up. You want to make sure you're only putting in big chips with hands that can stand up to a lot of pressure. If you notice your opponent is ramping up their aggression, don't be afraid to slow down and let them take the lead. Sometimes, calling down with second pair or a weak top pair is the right move, especially if you're getting good odds and you know they're capable of bluffing. The game changes as players adjust and react to each other. Loose aggressive players might start to notice you're calling them down more often, or they might tighten up after losing a few pots. When this happens, be ready to switch gears. If their aggression drops, you can start value betting more frequently. If they're still firing with any two cards, keep controlling pot size and let them make mistakes. There's no single formula for post-flop play against loose aggressive opponents, but you can build a toolkit. Use continuation bets wisely, favoring boards and hands where you have the advantage. Pay attention to their betting patterns and respond to changes in their approach. Keep pots manageable when you're unsure, and be ready to shift your strategy as the table dynamic evolves. Each adjustment you make helps you capture value and avoid traps, letting you stay one step ahead as the session unfolds. Take your time with each hand. Let the action come to you, And remember that patience is as much a weapon as aggression. With each decision, you'll get better at finding the right balance and making the most of every opportunity. Chapter 7. Leveraging position against lags. Your seat at the table shapes how much you know before you act. That gap might seem small hand to hand, but it compounds quietly across a long session. In No Limit Texas Hold'em, your position relative to the dealer button determines when you act in each round of betting. If you act later in the round, you get to see what others do first. That extra information lets you make more accurate, less risky choices. It means you're betting, calling, or folding with more context. When you act earlier, you're deciding with less to go on. That can leave you exposed to pressure and guessing at what others might do. The impact of position becomes even clearer when loose, aggressive players join the game. That pressure tends to force reactions from everyone around them. When they are to your right, you get to see their actions before you decide. This tends to be the easier way to play against them. When they are to your left, you must act first, without knowing if they will raise or call behind you. In those situations, your range of playable hands tends to shrink. You'll sometimes fold hands you'd otherwise play, and you may lean towards smaller bets, or avoid marginal spots altogether. Many players seek to sit directly to the left of a loose, aggressive opponent. That's not random. In a 9-handed game, there's roughly a 1 in 8 chance of sitting directly to the left of any particular player by random assignment. Players actively seek these spots for good reason. Acting after the aggressive player means you can respond to what they do rather than guessing what they might do. That's not just about comfort. It tends to translate into a real edge across many hands. A lag does more than play a lot of hands. Their constant pressure shifts how everyone else at the table behaves. This can lead to mistakes, rushed decisions, or folds that might not happen in a calmer game. When you have position on these players, you can slow the pace when needed, or choose to escalate when you have strong information. Without position, you are more likely to be the one reacting, which lowers your ability to realize the full value of your hands. Over time, this kind of positional disadvantage can quietly weigh on your overall results. Knowing how to use position is not just about playing more hands from late position. It's about shaping your actions to match the information you're gaining. When you are last to act, you can see how many players are interested in the pot and how aggressive they are. This lets you select the right hands to play and the right moments to apply pressure. Against loose, aggressive opponents, this information is especially useful, since their range of hands is wide and their willingness to continue is often high. The real value in position comes from how it lets you exploit patterns in loose, aggressive play. When you act after a loose, aggressive player, you can start to observe their tendencies. If they bet often but fold to raises, you can plan to check raise or call more often. If they slow down when you show strength, you can use this knowledge to control the size of the pot. Timing becomes crucial. Sometimes you let the lag take the lead, allowing them to build the pot with weak hands. Other times you step in with a raise to test their resolve. Being in position lets you apply selective aggression. This doesn't mean always raising or bluffing. It means choosing moments when the board texture and your hand both support a strong play. If a lag bets into you and the board favors your range, you have the choice to raise for value or to see another card with a call. The key is that you're never forced into action. You're responding with more knowledge than your opponent. Well-timed raises against loose, aggressive players can have extra value. Some loose, aggressive players tend to push the action until they encounter real resistance. When you raise, you sometimes induce folds from hands that would have continued with a call or another bet. Other times you force the lag to play a bigger pot with a weaker hand. Both outcomes can be profitable when you're in position and can reevaluate based on their response. Seat selection is a long-term edge. If you have the choice, sitting to the left of a lag can increase your profit potential over many sessions. If you keep finding yourself out of position against the same aggressive player, changing seats or tables is worth considering. Over time, these small adjustments can significantly impact your results. When you can't avoid being out of position against a loose, aggressive player, the game changes. You often find yourself reacting rather than dictating the action. This reactive stance tends to mean more check calling with hands that aren't strong enough to raise and aren't weak enough to fold. The lag's pressure can make these spots expensive. Their bets can pressure you into defending with weaker hands or folding away equity. Managing the pot size becomes even more important out of position. You want to avoid building large pots with marginal hands. Careful bet sizing can help. Sometimes you check to control the pace. Other times you might make a small bet to define the strength of your hand without committing too much. If you sense the loose, aggressive player is likely to bet every time you check, you might lead out with a bet instead, putting them in a position to reveal more about their hand. Occasionally, bluff raising out of position can end the hand early. It uses the threat of a strong hand to take away the pot before things get expensive. Instead of check calling down and facing tough decisions, you take the initiative and put the lag to a decision. This tends to work best when the board texture supports a strong hand, and when you sense your opponent is overextending. It's not a move to use every time, but it offers a way to avoid being constantly on the back foot. Another important adjustment is recognizing when to let go of hands early. If the flop brings a difficult board and you are out of position against a lag who will likely keep betting, folding now can save you from tough spots on later streets. Not every hand is worth defending. Knowing when to step away is just as valuable as knowing when to push back. Watching how the rest of the table responds to the lag can open up new opportunities. Sometimes the table tightens up in response to constant aggression. If this happens, you might find chances to steal pots when the lag is not involved. Adapt not only to the lag, but to the shifting table dynamics. Your awareness of these trends is another layer of positional leverage. Over time, learning to use your seat to its fullest gives you more control in every hand you play. Decisions feel less rushed. You're able to shape the size of the pot, the pace of the betting, and your own risk level. Whether you are in position or not, understanding how to use what you know about the table and the players around you becomes the foundation for a more confident, resilient poker game. The rhythm of the table is always there if you let it guide you. Your seat is telling you something before every decision. Chapter 8: Bet Sizing Tactics. When you're playing against loose, aggressive opponents, your seat at the table means everything. When you act after them, you get to see what they do before you commit any chips. This advantage lets you shape your betting approach in ways that can put them off balance. Position gives you more choices, and it makes your bet sizes even more powerful as tools for controlling the action. Bet sizing is one of the most direct ways to manage the dynamics of the table. Against loose, aggressive players, you want to think carefully about how much you bet and why. These players often call with a wider range than the situation might justify. When you hold a strong hand, there's a reasonable case for sizing up compared to what you might do against a tighter player. Larger bets in those spots can extract more value, particularly against opponents who've shown a tendency to call down with second-best hands. On the other hand, you don't always want to bet big. Sometimes smaller bets can serve you better. If you have a strong hand and think a loose aggressive player is likely to attack what looks like weakness, a small bet can be an invitation. They may see your small bet as a chance to bluff or raise you with a weak hand. Letting them hang themselves with a bluff is sometimes more profitable than trying to win a big pot right away. Your hand strength should guide your approach. With the best hand, you want to get as much money in the pot as the situation allows. You're looking for a size that worse hands will still find worth calling, without going so large that your opponent only continues with hands that beat you. When you're bluffing, you want your bet size to apply the right amount of pressure. If your bet is too small, a loose aggressive player might call you with almost anything. If your bet is too large, you risk getting raised by someone who loves to push back, and you might end up folding a hand that had some equity. It's important not to let your bet sizes give away your intentions. If you always bet large with strong hands but small with bluffs, even a loose aggressive opponent might catch on. They might start folding when you bet big and attack your smaller bets. Keeping your bet sizes consistent, or at least balanced between value and bluffs, makes you much harder to read. The goal is to maximize your returns when you have the goods, but also to minimize your risk when you're making a move. Every table is different, and every loose aggressive player has their own habits. Some will call no matter what you do. Some will raise at any sign of weakness. You need to adjust your sizing strategy to fit the exact player and situation. Over time, you'll learn how much is too much and how little is too little. Watch how they react to different bet sizes and let that guide your decisions in future hands. Let's look at how you can use bet sizing to manipulate the tendencies of loose aggressive players. These opponents often float the flop, meaning they call with weak hands, hoping to take the pot away later. If you make larger bets, you put pressure on them to fold their weak holdings. Sometimes, a big bet is enough to stop them from floating altogether. Other times it can make them overcommit with hands that don't have much chance of improving. If you notice your opponent likes to raise when you show any sign of weakness, you can use smaller bets to set a trap. A small bet can look like you're not confident, inviting them to make a move. When they raise, you can respond with a strong hand and take advantage of their aggression. This works best when you're confident that your opponent can't help themselves from attacking what looks like weakness. Mixing up your bet sizes can also disrupt their rhythm. Loose aggressive players thrive on patterns and predictability. If you always make the same size bet in the same situation, they'll adjust and start exploiting your habits. By varying your bet sizes, you introduce uncertainty. They won't know if your big bet means strength or if your small bet is a trap. This confusion can lead them to make mistakes, such as calling too wide or bluffing into your strong hands. The psychological impact of bet sizing can't be overstated. A sudden large bet can make even the most aggressive player pause. They'll have to think about whether you're strong or just trying to scare them. A small bet, on the other hand, might embolden them to try something reckless. The key is to read the table and notice how your opponents react to different bet sizes. If you notice a player tends to fold to larger bets, that pattern is worth remembering. If another consistently attacks smaller bets, you can build traps around that tendency when the opportunity fits. Bet sizing is not just about the chips in the pot. It's about steering the action and controlling how your opponents respond. By using different bet sizes, you can push loose aggressive players into uncomfortable spots. Sometimes you want to build a big pot when you're likely ahead. Other times, you want to keep the pot small or invite a mistake. The right bet size depends on your hand, your opponent's tendencies, and the flow of the game. Now, let's talk about unpredictability. If you develop a habit of always betting the same amount in the same situation, sharp players are likely to notice. Loose, aggressive opponents might not always seem observant, but over time they pick up on patterns. If they realize you only bet big with strong hands, they'll start folding to your big bets. If they notice you only make small bets when you're weak, they'll attack you relentlessly. To keep them guessing, you need to mix up your bet sizes in similar spots. Sometimes bet large with a bluff. Other times, bet small with a strong hand. The point isn't to be random for the sake of it, but to prevent your opponents from getting a read on you. When they can't predict what your bet size means, they're more likely to make mistakes. This unpredictability is a big part of long-term success against loose, aggressive players. One way to avoid falling into patterns is to introduce a small amount of structure to your variation ahead of time. You might decide before a session to mix your sizing in a specific way in certain spots. That kind of intentional variety helps you stay unpredictable without relying on in-the-moment improvisation. The important thing is to keep your ranges balanced. You want to have both value hands and bluffs in your large bets and your small bets. This way, your opponents can't adjust by simply folding or calling based on your bet size alone. Balancing your bet sizing is a skill that takes practice. It's easy to fall into habits, especially when you're playing a lot of hands. Take the time to look back at your sessions and see if you're giving anything away with your bet sizes. If you notice you always make the same bet with the same hand type, make a conscious effort to mix it up. Over time, this will become second nature, and your opponents will have a much harder time figuring you out. Against loose, aggressive players, unpredictability is one of the more reliable tools you have. When they don't know what to expect, they can't exploit you. They'll be the ones guessing, and that's where you want them. You're not just betting chips. You're shaping the story of the hand and keeping your opponents off balance. As you sit quietly at the table, chips in hand, take a moment to watch your opponents. Let your bet sizes speak for you, sometimes loud, sometimes soft. The more you keep them uncertain, the more control you'll have. That's the heart of bet sizing tactics against loose, aggressive players. Let your decisions flow with the rhythm of the table, and keep your intentions hidden just below the surface. Chapter 9: Psychological Warfare. There's a version of pressure that doesn't come from big bets or bold bluffs. It comes from stillness. When you stay composed at a table that's designed to unsettle you, you're already doing something most players can't. Your demeanor becomes a signal. Your timing becomes a message. And the opponent across from you starts to feel something they didn't expect. If you remain calm and steady, you create a different kind of pressure. This approach focuses on composure rather than flashy moves. Your steady presence becomes the foundation of your strategy. Every time you act with purpose, you make it harder for a loose, aggressive opponent to read you or push you off your game. A steady table image can unsettle even the most confident, loose, aggressive player. When you act without hesitation and keep your betting routine consistent, you are sending a message. You are saying that you are not afraid. That can make a loose, aggressive player pause, even if just for a moment. Over time, this kind of psychological pressure adds complexity to their decisions. They start to wonder if their aggression is really going to work against you. The more you project confidence, the more you force them to consider the possibility that you are not easily rattled. Table image is rarely irrelevant. If you have been showing discipline and making deliberate decisions, opponents may start to see you as someone who does not back down easily. Loose, aggressive players tend to look for signs of weakness. When they can't find any, they'll sometimes hesitate or second-guess their usual approach. That's why avoiding erratic behavior and nervous timing matters. When you're holding a strong hand, act with the same confidence you'd bring to any other decision at the table. Consistency in your actions projects strength and keeps your opponents guessing. Sometimes it is the subtle shifts in your demeanor that have the greatest effect. A calm look, a steady hand, or a smooth chip movement can make an opponent wonder what you are holding. These players pay close attention to those details, even if they don't admit it. If you don't show fear or frustration, you're not giving them the fuel they rely on. Over many hands, this can disrupt their rhythm and force mistakes. Psychological leverage doesn't rely on intimidation. Instead, it creates uncertainty and complexity for your opponents. The more they have to think, the less automatic their aggression becomes. By maintaining composure and projecting quiet confidence, you are influencing the flow of play in ways that go beyond the cards and chips in front of you. There are several ways to introduce doubt and hesitation into the mind of a loose, aggressive player. One of the most effective is to use consistent betting patterns. When you size your bets in a way that generally makes sense for the strength of your hand, you give your opponents less to work with. Loose, aggressive players prefer chaos and unpredictability. If you deny them that, they are often forced to slow down and consider their options more carefully. Deliberate timing is another way to disrupt aggressive tendencies. If you act with purpose and avoid rushing or stalling without reason, you can start to set the pace on your own terms. Loose, aggressive players want to control the tempo. If you take that away, you introduce a layer of psychological complexity. They now have to adjust to your timing rather than dictating their own. This shift can turn their confidence into uncertainty. Sometimes, a well-timed raise will put pressure back on a loose, aggressive player. When you challenge their wide range with a strong and purposeful action, you force them to reassess. They may start to worry that their usual aggression will run into resistance. This can sometimes lead to hesitation or a gradual shift toward more conservative play. On the other hand, some loose, aggressive players respond by overcompensating with even more aggression. Either way, you are disrupting their natural rhythm and making them uncomfortable. Varying your bet sizing in a deliberate but unexpected way is another tool. If you sometimes make a larger bet in a spot where they expect a smaller one, or vice versa, you force them out of their comfort zone. They have to stop and think about what your sizing means. This pause is often enough to break their flow and make them uncertain. The key is to make these changes in a way that still fits your overall strategy. Random changes are not effective, but thoughtful adjustments can have a real impact. When you use these tactics together, you are shaping the dynamics of the table. Loose, aggressive players who are forced to respond rather than initiate are far more likely to make mistakes. Doubt and hesitation are not weaknesses you can see, but you can sense them in the way your opponents act. When they take longer to make decisions, or when their bets become inconsistent, it can be a sign that your approach is starting to affect them. Psychological warfare is demanding work. Unsettling your opponents is only part of it. You also have to protect your own composure in the process. Loose, aggressive players apply constant pressure. They want to provoke mistakes and emotional reactions. If you are not prepared, it is easy to slip into reactive play or even tilt. That is why staying focused and composed under pressure is so important. One useful technique is to practice patience. Do not rush decisions, even when the action is fast. Take a moment to breathe and consider your options. Controlled breathing is one way to help reset your focus between hands. It helps you stay grounded and prevents emotional swings from affecting your play. After a difficult hand, take a brief pause before the next one. This reset allows you to regain your focus and approach each hand with a clear mind. Self-awareness is another critical skill. Pay attention to your own emotional state. If you notice frustration or impatience creeping in, acknowledge it and take steps to calm yourself. Emotional control is what separates strong players from those who struggle against aggression. When you can maintain your composure no matter what happens, your strategies remain effective and your decisions are more likely to hold up over time. Developing a strong mental game gives you a consistent edge. Loose, aggressive players tend to be volatile. They can go on big runs, but they're also prone to mistakes when their aggression is met with steady resistance. If you can stay resilient and focused, you will be able to capitalize on their errors and maintain your advantage. Mental fortitude isn't optional. It's a core part of how you hold your edge over time. When you combine psychological strategy with technical skill, you often start to see the game differently. Gestures, pauses, and bet sizes can all carry meaning at the table. Loose, aggressive players who once felt overwhelming can start to seem more manageable. You're likely to recognize their vulnerabilities and learn how to exploit them. Over time, you will find that psychological warfare is not about overpowering your opponents. It is about guiding the flow of the game and maintaining control, one steady decision at a time. When you settle into this mindset, the table feels quieter. The pressure shifts, and the game unfolds on your terms. Chapter 10: Harmonizing Tilt and Emotional Play. Some players take a bad beat and move on without changing anything about the way they play. Others carry it with them, and you can feel it in the way they start playing. That shift in behavior is one of the most exploitable patterns at the table. It appears most quickly in players already running hot with aggression, because the swings that come with that style can be emotionally punishing. Loose, aggressive players are especially vulnerable to tilt after losing a large pot. Sometimes, a series of tough hands can push them over the edge. The feeling of being outdrawn or repeatedly bluffed can trigger emotional reactions. When this happens, their play may no longer follow a clear logic. Instead, you'll notice changes in how they act and bet. There are several ways to spot tilt in an opponent. Some players show it through their body language. They might sigh, speak sharply, or move their chips with more force. Others speed up their actions, betting or raising without their usual pause to think. Many will start playing more hands or making bigger bets than before. You might notice them entering pots with weaker holdings or firing off large bluffs on multiple streets. All of these are signals that emotions are taking the lead. If you watch closely, you can often sense when a player's aggression stops serving a plan and starts looking reckless. Their bets might get larger, and the timing less predictable. They may react to almost any resistance by ramping up the pressure, hoping to win back what they lost. This over-aggression is a clear sign that tilt is in play. Recognizing these shifts early gives you a real edge. When you suspect someone's tilting, the first adjustment is to widen your value betting range. They're more likely to call or raise with weaker holdings than they normally would. Hands you typically check can become profitable bets. Their emotional state tends to create the opportunities without you forcing anything. Calling down lighter is another adjustment worth making. When a tilted player keeps firing across several streets, your bluff catching range earns more than it usually would. Marginal holdings carry more value when their bluff frequency climbs. Trapping tends to be more effective than usual in these spots. A tilted player is more likely to overplay or push a bluff when you show passivity. That patience often rewards you. It's tempting to match their energy, but pushing back aggressively often backfires. A tilted player may be less likely to fold than usual, which means bluff raising with weak or marginal hands can invite a stubborn call or a re-raise you weren't ready for. The cleaner play is to focus on value and let them hand you the mistakes. Position matters here. If a seat change is possible, getting direct position on a tilted player can give you more control over pot sizing and better information when decisions get difficult. Weigh that against the reads you've built on the rest of the table. Sometimes staying put serves your overall game better. While you are watching for signs of tilt in others, it is just as important to guard against it in yourself. Most players experience frustration at some point, especially in long sessions or after a bad beat. The key is to notice these feelings early. If you feel your focus slipping or your emotions rising, step away from the table for a few minutes. A short break can clear your mind and help you regain control. Developing mental resilience starts with accepting that poker plays out over a long stretch. Focusing on probabilistic outcomes rather than any single hand can help steady your emotions. You'll win and lose plenty of hands, and it's the quality of your decisions over time that tends to matter most. A pre-session routine can help. Some players take a few quiet minutes to settle before they sit down. That kind of preparation makes the early swings easier to absorb. Reviewing your hands after a session and trying not to be too hard on yourself helps you catch patterns before they become habits. Staying calm and composed isn't just about avoiding your own errors. It tends to help you see the table more clearly and recognize the opportunities that others are creating. When you keep your emotions in check, you become less predictable and harder to play against. Poker rewards those who manage their mindset as carefully as they manage their chips. The next time you notice a player's emotions taking over, remember that patience and observation can turn their tilt into your opportunity. Staying aware of your own state of mind will keep you sharp and ready for what comes next. Let the game slow down for a moment, and let your best decisions guide you. Chapter 11. Balancing aggression with patience. Some players never slow down. They raise and re-raise, pushing every edge, and the pace they set pulls others along with them. The longer you sit across from that kind of player, the more you feel the pressure to match them. That pull is worth paying attention to, because resisting it at the right moments is where a lot of your edge comes from. Balancing these two traits means knowing when to push and when to wait. It's not about being relentlessly aggressive or permanently cautious. Instead, it is about switching between assertive betting and measured restraint, depending on what the table and your opponents are showing you. If you keep betting and raising relentlessly, opponents will tend to spot your pattern and adjust. And if you lean too far toward caution, you'll likely miss profitable opportunities. Over many hands, the players who mix up their approach tend to avoid becoming predictable. This helps them sustain more consistent results during long sessions. Loose, aggressive players thrive on putting others to difficult decisions. They like to keep the pressure on, hoping to force folds or induce mistakes. But if you match their aggression without thinking, you'll often find yourself on the wrong side of variance. The key is to recognize that their frequent pressure creates openings. Instead of getting drawn into every battle, you can wait for spots where their aggression becomes a weakness. When you find the right moments to press back, you can take advantage of their mistakes. It's this alternation between action and patience that helps you keep control of your own results. Poker is a game of incomplete information, and your opponents are always watching. If you play a single style for too long, you become easier to read. This is why balancing aggression and patience is not just about individual hands. It's about the overall flow of your session. Players who vary their aggression levels based on situation and opponent tendencies often seem to experience smaller swings in their bankroll over time. They're less likely to go on wild upswings or downswings because their play adapts to what's happening around them. This balance is especially important when sessions stretch for hours and fatigue sets in. Let us look at how you can decide when to press your advantage and when to hold back, especially against loose, aggressive opponents. These players often create their own problems by betting and raising too much. If you are patient, you will see them fall into patterns and repeat mistakes. One key is to notice when their pressure lets up. For example, if a loose, aggressive player has been betting every hand but suddenly checks back on the flop, that can be a sign their aggression has diminished for the moment. This could present an opportunity for you to apply pressure, especially if you sense they don't want to commit further chips. Still, you don't want to fall into the trap of overextension. It's easy to get caught up in the pace set by a loose, aggressive opponent. The warning signs are worth watching for. If you find yourself playing more hands than usual, chasing pots out of position, or feeling compelled to fight every battle, your decision-making may be slipping. Position is a big part of this dynamic. Playing out of position against a loose, aggressive player puts you at a disadvantage. You have to act before you see what they do, and it's harder to know when your aggression will work. In these spots, restraint is often more profitable than trying to match their energy. Sometimes the best move is to let them win a small pot now and wait for a better spot later. This takes discipline, but it protects your stack and keeps you in control. Self-awareness is another part of this. You need to check in with your own mindset as the session goes on. If you notice your play getting looser or more reckless, it's time to pause and reset. Players who cannot spot their own overextension often see their bankroll shrink faster than those who stay vigilant. Take a breath, look at the table, and ask yourself if your decisions are still grounded in good strategy or if you are reacting emotionally to opponent aggression. Maintaining a consistent winning strategy over time isn't easy, especially when the table is full of loose, aggressive players. The temptation to get involved in every pot or to force action in marginal spots can wear on your patience. But patience is exactly what you need to wait for the best opportunities. For example, the chance of being dealt any pocket pair before the flop is roughly 6%. That means most hands you're dealt won't be strong. You need to resist the urge to play every hand just because others are being aggressive. Let the game come to you. A disciplined approach to hand selection and decision-making tends to serve you well over time. Stick to the strategies you know work, even if the table feels chaotic. Track your own play and look for patterns in your decisions. If you notice that you're getting dragged into pots you'd normally avoid, take a step back. As the session unfolds and table dynamics shift, be willing to adjust your aggression levels. In many full-ring games, players who make these adjustments as the table changes tend to sustain results more consistently than those who stick to one style. A steady mindset is your anchor. Loose, aggressive players want you to react emotionally. They want you to chase after lost pots or to push back out of frustration. When you stay calm and disciplined, you make fewer costly errors. You'll find that the patience to wait for loose, aggressive opponents to make mistakes is often rewarded. Their style creates swings, but your consistency and self-control keep you on track. There's something steady about sticking to your plan, while others exhaust themselves. Let them take the wild swings, while you keep your focus. Over the long run, players who can balance aggression with patience tend to walk away with steadier results. Sometimes the best move is to wait. Sometimes it's to push. The skill lies in knowing which is which, and having the discipline to act accordingly. When the session grows long, and the table grows restless, that balance becomes your greatest advantage. Chapter 12. Advanced Bluffing Techniques. Let's look at how to build advanced bluffing strategies when you're facing loose, aggressive players. These are opponents who bet and raise with a wider range of hands than most. If you want to succeed against them, you'll need to set up multi-street bluffs that use timing and bet sizing to put real pressure on their decisions. The first step is to think about your plan before you act. You're not just betting this street. You're considering how you'll follow through on later streets if your opponent continues. When you initiate a bluff, you'll want to make sure your bets tell a believable story. Each bet should fit with the board texture and the range of hands you're representing. If the community cards favor your supposed range, that's the time to keep applying pressure. Bet sizing is one of your best tools. When you're bluffing, try to keep your bet sizes consistent with how you'd bet your strong value hands. This way you're not giving away clues about your hand's true strength. If you always bet the same amount, whether you're strong or bluffing, loose aggressive opponents can't easily pick you apart. It's the unpredictability that makes your bluffs more effective. As covered earlier, multi-street bluffs require planning for each street before you commit to the first bet. The key is deciding in advance how you'll respond if your opponent calls, so each follow-up bet feels like a natural continuation of the same story. Each new bet adds more fold equity, especially when your opponent's range is wide and likely full of marginal hands. The deeper the stacks, the more you can pressure these players by putting a meaningful portion of their chips at risk. But you'll want to avoid overcommitting. If you risk too much against a player who might call you down light, you're just burning chips. Consistency in your story is crucial. If your bets suddenly change in size or style, observant opponents may sense you're bluffing. Try to match your bet sizing to what you'd do if you actually had the strong hand you're representing. This steady pressure forces loose, aggressive players to make tough choices with hands that can't stand up to multiple bets. Now let's talk about using reverse psychology. This is a powerful tool when you want to create confusion and uncertainty. Sometimes, acting weak when you're strong can induce loose, aggressive players to bluff into you. They might see your hesitation as weakness and try to take the pot away. By setting this trap, you let their own aggression work against them. You can also mix up your timing to keep opponents off balance. If you act quickly with some bluffs and take your time with others, it disrupts their ability to read you. Loose, aggressive players often rely on snap judgments and pattern recognition. When your timing doesn't match their expectations, they're more likely to make mistakes. Another way to use reverse psychology is to build a reputation for being solid and trustworthy. If you play straightforwardly for a while, then suddenly make a large bluff, you're more likely to get credit for a real hand. This is especially effective against loose, aggressive players who are always looking for signs of weakness. When you change gears, there's a real chance of catching them off guard. Check-raise bluffs are another advanced weapon. When you check-raise, you're telling a story of great strength. Loose, aggressive players who have bet with marginal hands may feel maximum pressure and fold. This move works best on the turn or river, when the pot is larger and the pressure is higher. If you use steady bet sizes regardless of your true hand strength, you keep your opponents guessing about your range. The uncertainty you create makes it hard for them to know when you're bluffing or when you have it. Let's turn to identifying the best bluffing spots. The key here is pattern recognition. Loose, aggressive players often have repeating habits. They might double barrel frequently, committing chips on 2 streets with a range that includes plenty of weak holdings. If you notice this pattern, you can plan a bluff raise on the turn, especially if the board favors the range you're representing. Timing plays a significant role in whether a bluff lands. The best moments to bluff are when loose, aggressive opponents are in late position and have been raising a lot. If you've noticed they tend to give up when faced with resistance, that pattern can point toward a reasonable spot to apply pressure. You'll also want to watch for hesitation or uncertainty in their actions. These are often signs they're holding a weaker hand. Some loose, aggressive players have a low went to showdown percentage. This means they don't like calling big bets all the way to the river. When you spot this, you can increase your bluffing frequency, especially with advanced moves like turn, check, raise, all-ins. The more pressure you apply, the more likely they'll fold those marginal hands. It's important to adapt as the table dynamics change. If a loose, aggressive player starts to tighten up, or if other players begin challenging them, you may need to adjust your bluffing strategy. Stay alert to shifts in the game. What worked an orbit ago may not work in the next one. Flexibility is as important as aggression. Bluffing opportunities often appear when the board helps your story. If the community cards make it more likely you've hit a strong hand, you can use that to your advantage. Loose, aggressive players know these spots can be dangerous for them. If they sense the board has favored your range, your bluff has a better chance of succeeding. Reading betting patterns and timing tells gives you another edge. Over a long session, you'll gather information about how loose, aggressive players react to different bet sizes and situations. Use this data to spot when they're likely to fold and when they're likely to fight back. The more tendencies you recognize, the more precise your bluffing becomes. You don't need to bluff every hand to beat loose, aggressive players. The goal is to pick your spots carefully, line up your story, and apply steady pressure when the odds are in your favor. By setting up multi-street bluffs, using reverse psychology, and recognizing the right moments, you'll keep your opponents guessing and put yourself in position to win more pots. There's a quiet satisfaction in seeing a plan unfold as your opponent lays down their hand. You've read the table, tracked the patterns, and adjusted your approach. Sometimes, the best feeling comes not from the cards you hold, but from the story you tell and the pressure you apply. Let the table settle for a moment. Let your mind replay the sequence. Each advanced bluff is a step toward mastery, a sign that you're seeing more than just the cards in front of you. Chapter 13: Dealing with Multiple Lags. When you find yourself at a table with several loose, aggressive players, it helps to start by figuring out which opponents are most likely to cause trouble. Not every aggressive player presents the same level of threat. Some might fire away often, but with small stacks, while others can put your entire stack at risk with a single move. The first step is to scan the table and watch for players who raise and re-raise more often than anyone else, especially before the flop. These are usually the ones who keep the pressure on, putting others in tough spots over and over again. Behavioral cues give you even more information. You might notice a player who never seems to hesitate, bets assertively, and is quick to challenge anyone who stands in their way. These patterns often mark the most dangerous opponents. When someone consistently forces the action with large bets or frequent raises, they can quickly build pots and threaten your stack. If you see someone constantly disrupting the rhythm of the table, that player should move up your list of priorities. Stack size matters as well. A loose, aggressive player with a deep stack can potentially threaten your entire stack, while a short-stacked player tends to be less dangerous in terms of potential loss. Pay close attention to where these players sit relative to your seat. An aggressive player acting after you has more power to apply pressure than one who acts before you. The combination of frequency, stack size, and position helps you rank the threats at the table. Once you have a sense of who the most disruptive players are, it makes sense to focus your adjustments on them first. If you can limit the damage they do to your stack, you will have more breathing room to handle the rest of the table. Sometimes that means playing tighter when they are in the hand, or even avoiding certain spots unless you have a strong holding. Recognizing and prioritizing the most active and dangerous players is the foundation for surviving and thriving when facing multiple loose aggressive opponents. When several loose aggressive players are present, the entire table dynamic can change. Pots often get bigger and more frequent. There is a general sense of volatility that can lead to wild swings. In these games, it is important to pay close attention to how the aggressive players interact with each other. Their confrontations can reveal a lot about their tendencies. For example, you might notice that one player always backs down when another shows strength, or that two of them get into raising wars with marginal holdings. These patterns create opportunities for you to exploit. It is not just about how each aggressive player acts individually, but also about how they affect the rest of the table. Loose aggressive players often set the pace for the game, putting others on the defensive. This can lead to mistakes, especially when players feel pressured to respond with aggression of their own. By watching closely, you may spot when the table is about to explode into a big pot, or when everyone else has started to tighten up out of fear. Both situations can be useful, depending on your own position and stack. Position becomes even more valuable in these environments. If you find yourself out of position against one or more aggressive players, you will have a much harder time controlling the size of the pot or dictating the action. Many players in no-limit Texas Hold'em will even request new seats to gain a positional advantage over the most disruptive opponents. Sitting to the left of a particularly aggressive player allows you to act after them, giving you more information and control. If you cannot change seats, you may need to adjust your hand selection and avoid tricky situations when out of position. The collective behavior of multiple loose aggressive players can also create opportunities. When two or more of them clash, they frequently make mistakes or overextend themselves. You do not need to be involved in every big pot. Sometimes, the best move is to sit back, observe, and wait for a spot where their volatility works in your favor. Picking your battles carefully, especially when you have the advantage of position, can make a big difference in your results. With all this aggression flying around, preserving your stack becomes a key goal. One of the most effective ways to do this is by tightening your starting hand selection. Against multiple loose aggressive players, you will want to avoid getting involved with marginal hands that struggle to stand up to heavy action. This does not mean you need to play passively, but rather that you should choose your spots with care. The more you protect your chips, the more options you will have later in the session. It's also important to avoid unnecessary confrontations. Not every challenge from an aggressive player requires a response. Folding in marginal spots keeps you out of trouble and conserves your stack for better opportunities. Stack preservation isn't just about surviving. It's about keeping enough chips to make strong moves when the time is right. When you let your stack get whittled down by reckless confrontations, you lose flexibility and find yourself forced into tough decisions. The mental side of the game becomes even more important as the chaos builds. Facing relentless aggression can be exhausting and frustrating. It is easy to get caught up in the action and start making decisions out of emotion rather than logic. Staying calm and composed is crucial. If you feel frustration creeping in, take a breath and remind yourself that discipline is just as important as any technical adjustment. Tilt can easily turn small mistakes into big losses, especially in games with wild swings. Discipline means folding when you should, even if it feels like you are being pushed around. It also means staying patient and waiting for the right moment to strike. The more you can keep your emotions in check, the better you will be at making sound decisions over the long run. In games with several loose, aggressive players, your ability to recognize threats, adapt to the shifting dynamics, and preserve your stack will help you stay ahead. Maintaining focus and composure lets you navigate the turbulence and keep your edge no matter how chaotic the table becomes. Take your time, trust your process, and let the game come to you. Chapter 14: Long-term adjustments and learning. Let's start by thinking about the way you approach your poker sessions over time. When you play against loose, aggressive players, it's easy to get caught up in the moment and react hand by hand. But if you want to improve long-term, you'll want to look back at entire sessions, or even stretches of many games. By reviewing what's happened in the past, you can pick up on patterns that repeat themselves. This kind of review might mean going over notes you've taken, or thinking back to situations where the same player showed the same tendency more than once. You'll often notice that certain aggressive opponents raise more frequently than others. Some players just can't resist making those 3 bets or 4 bets over and over, even when the situation barely calls for it. When you take the time to look back, you'll see these habits stand out across several sessions. Over time, the same player tends to show up with similar lines, consistent bet sizes, or familiar timing tells. It's not always obvious in the moment, but when you go through your notes or recall those hands later, the patterns begin to show. Let's say you spot a player who checks in the same spots, or another who calls down light but never seems to take the initiative themselves. These tendencies, whether it's repeated checking, frequent calls in certain positions, or a reluctance to bet, are not just quirks. They're windows into how that player thinks about the game. If you keep track of these actions over many sessions, you'll start to see which habits are reliable and which ones are just passing phases. Over the long run, these tendencies become exploitable. Keeping organized records or simple notes can really help. You don't need to write down every detail, but noting who is 3-betting too much, who is reluctant to lead out, or who always seems to call from the blinds can help you spot trends you might miss otherwise. If you see the same behavior from a player across weeks or months, you can trust it's part of their core approach. This lets you plan your own adjustments with more confidence. Once you get in the habit of reviewing your sessions, your mind becomes more attuned to these patterns in real time. When you sit down to play, you're not just starting from scratch. You're building on a foundation of what you've observed before, and that gives you an edge that most players overlook. Now, let's talk about how these loose, aggressive players change their tactics as they gain more experience or as the table changes. You'll notice that a strategy that worked against a particular opponent last week might not work as well the next time you meet. Maybe they've noticed you adjusting, or maybe they've seen others respond to their aggression and have decided to tighten up a bit. Whatever the reason, you can't expect the same counter strategy to work forever. That's where your observational skills really matter. You want to watch for signs that the aggressive player is changing gears. Maybe their 3 bets become less frequent, Maybe they're folding to re-raises more often than before. Sometimes, you'll see that their bet sizes start to shrink, or that they're not contesting as many pots from early position. Each of these changes is a clue that you need to update your own approach. It's also helpful to watch how they respond to pressure. If you start pushing back and they keep firing, you might be dealing with someone who's not easily moved off their plan. But if you notice that they become more selective and only fire big bets with stronger hands, that's a sign you should tighten up your own calling and raising ranges. When a loose aggressive player moves from playing wild, unpredictable ranges to a more disciplined style, it's time for you to shift as well. If you keep countering the old version of that player, you might find yourself making costly mistakes. Staying flexible is the key. You want to update your reads regularly, not just at the start of a session, but hand by hand. That way, you're not over-adjusting or getting stuck in a pattern that your opponent has already moved past. The best players are always ready to adapt, and that's especially true when facing skilled, loose, aggressive opponents who are also trying to stay one step ahead. Let's move on to what it means to really commit to improving over time. Even if you're already good at reading tendencies and adapting to shifts, poker is a game that never stands still. New strategies come up, the player pool evolves, and what worked last year might not be enough today. That's why it's so important to keep learning and reflecting on your own game. One of the most effective ways to grow is by integrating new strategies into your regular study. For example, you might spend some time reviewing how playing in position against loose aggressive players affected your results. Did you make more positive, expected value decisions when you had the advantage of acting last? If so, you can look for more ways to put yourself in those spots in the future. Deliberate practice is another big part of this process. That means not just playing hands, but really analyzing your decisions after the fact. Maybe you review a session and notice that slow playing premium hands against certain aggressive opponents worked well, or that 4-bet bluffing with a wider range paid off in specific situations. The point is to look for moments where your decisions either succeeded or fell short, and figure out why. Reflective review is not just about finding mistakes, though that's important. It's also about reinforcing what you did right, and understanding the reasoning behind your choices. Over time, this kind of self-assessment helps you make better decisions in the heat of the moment. It also helps you maintain your composure during the inevitable downswings that come from playing against aggressive opponents. When things are not going your way, sticking to a solid strategy and trusting in your process tends to pay off over time. Setting regular goals for your skill development can keep you moving forward. Maybe you decide to focus on improving your positional awareness, or you want to get better at recognizing when an opponent has shifted their style. You might set aside time each week to review educational materials, or seek feedback from players you trust. All of these efforts add up, and they'll help you stay current as poker strategies continue to evolve. Don't forget to keep an eye on the broader trends in the game. The best players are always learning, whether it's from studying new theory, watching high-level games, or discussing hands with others. If you keep an open mind and a willingness to adapt, you'll find that your game keeps improving over time. Take your time with each of these steps. Poker rewards patience and thoughtful observation. As you build your habits of review, adaptation, and learning, you'll notice your confidence growing. Your edge against loose, aggressive opponents will sharpen, and your results will start to reflect all the work you've put in. Sit back, breathe, and let the process unfold. The game will always offer new lessons, and you're well on your way to mastering them. Chapter 15. Final thoughts on mastering lags. When you sit down at a table and spot a player who's pushing the action, raising and re-raising more than anyone else, you know you're up against a loose, aggressive opponent. These players create a unique kind of pressure. They force everyone to make decisions more often and with less comfort. The most effective way to handle this is to stay flexible. You'll want to adjust your approach as the table changes, because no two sessions ever play out the same way. One of the main strategies against loose, aggressive players is to expand your own pre-flop ranges, especially when you're considering a 4-bet bluff. When you know someone is 3-betting and 4-betting more often than most, you can find spots to push back, but only if you pay attention to their patterns. This doesn't mean matching their aggression with wild play. Instead, you're looking for the right moments to widen your range, particularly when you sense their frequency is out of line. Position becomes even more important. When you're in position against a loose, aggressive player, you get to make decisions after they do. That extra information lets you control the size of the pot and the pace of the hand. You're less likely to find yourself trapped in a big pot with a marginal hand. This advantage is subtle but powerful, especially over many hands. It's also essential to notice how the table as a whole responds to this player. Loose, aggressive players can change the rhythm of a game. You'll see people tighten up, waiting for premium hands, or sometimes overreacting with big calls or raises. These shifts create new opportunities. If you're watching closely, you can spot when the table gets too passive or too eager to fight back, and you can find your own profitable spots. Patience and selective aggression are your best tools. You don't need to play back every time. Instead, let the loose, aggressive player make mistakes. When you choose your moments thoughtfully, you're more likely to catch them overextending. That's when you can extract the most value. Disciplined decision-making means you avoid the common traps these players set, like chasing after them with weak hands, or making emotional plays. Adaptability is central. A strategy that works one night might not work the next if the loose, aggressive player changes gears or if the table dynamic evolves. Stay alert, keep adjusting your ranges, and always factor in recent tendencies. Careful observation helps you refine your decisions over time. Now let's talk about the mindset you'll need over the long haul. Success against loose, aggressive players rarely comes from a single big hand. It builds slowly, as you stay patient and stick to your process. These opponents thrive on chaos and impulse, but you don't have to meet them on their terms. Instead, you'll want to play your own game. Let them take the risks, and wait for your edge to show. Patience isn't just about folding until you hit a strong hand. It's about waiting for the right situations to develop. Over many sessions, loose, aggressive players tend to make mistakes that you can exploit. If you're disciplined, you can take advantage of these errors without putting your own stack at unnecessary risk. That's where emotional control comes in. It's easy to get frustrated after losing a pot to a wild play. The challenge is to keep your focus and resist the urge to react without thinking. Tracking patterns is a quiet but vital habit. If you pay attention to how a loose, aggressive player reacts to different situations, you'll start to notice trends. Maybe they always fire a second barrel after a certain board texture, or they tend to slow down when facing resistance from certain opponents. These details add up over time. The more you recognize, the more you can anticipate and counter their moves. It's important to expect aggression. When you know it's coming, you can plan your responses in advance. You might decide to call down lighter, or to trap with a strong hand. By preparing for their style, you avoid being thrown off balance. This process-oriented mindset means you're focused on making good decisions hand after hand, rather than chasing short-term results. Over time, you'll notice that the best results come from staying steady and letting the math and the patterns work in your favor. There's no need to force action. Just keep making solid choices and let the loose, aggressive players' mistakes do the work for you. Of course, the game keeps changing. Loose, aggressive players evolve, and new strategies come into the mix. That's why regular practice and review are so important. After each session, take a little time to think about what worked and what didn't. Look for trends in your own play and in your opponent's adjustments. This habit keeps your skills sharp and helps you spot new ways to counter emerging tactics. Continuous learning is part of the process. The more you study, the more you'll see in real time. Seek out new resources. Talk to other players. Watch how top players adapt to aggressive opponents. Every new idea you encounter can add another layer to your approach. Analyzing session data is another way to stay ahead.